We have one more very inspiring keynote. I've mentioned it a few times already. We will welcome Cavoukian, and she is a legend in the field of privacy and has effortlessly taught us the concept of privacy by design, and she will now talk about the vital need for privacy by design. Anne is ranked among the top 5 women of influence. She is one of the Power 50 announced by the Canadian Business Magazine, and she is also one of the top 100 innovators worldwide. And she will now talk to us about, like I said, privacy by design, which means the proactive approach of embedding privacy already in the design stages and concept stages of your product and business development. And with that, I want to give it up for Anne Cavoukian.
Good day, ladies and gentlemen. It's such a pleasure to be speaking with you today. I wish I was there live in Vienna, but maybe next year, because I really want to point out all the problems associated with privacy these days, with surveillance mounting at an unbelievable pace, which calls for even stronger privacy protective measures. I always like to start by dispelling the myths. Next slide, please. Because there are so many myths that are abound. One of them, in the next slide, please, is that privacy somehow equals secrecy. It does not. Privacy is not about having something to hide, not at all. It's about control. In the next slide, privacy is all about control. And the next slide, you'll see privacy is about personal control. You have to be in control of the use and disclosure of your personal information. The freedom of choice is critical to freedom. And the Germans have a wonderful term for this called informational self-determination. That should be the individual who determines the fate of his or her personal information. And the reason for that is context is key. Only you know the context associated with your personal information. Is it sensitive? Is it not? Do you care if anybody else sees it or give it out to the world? It has to be your choice and your choice alone. In the next slide, the other reason privacy is so important is it's essential to freedom. Privacy forms the foundation of our freedom and open societies. If you want societal prosperity, if you want innovation, creativity, it all requires freedom. And that's what I like to remind people. If you value freedom, and who doesn't, we have to have privacy. Because you see, surveillance is the antithesis of privacy. One of the negative consequences of surveillance is that it usurps your limited cognitive bandwidth. It takes you away from innovation and creativity. We can't have that. We must have privacy and continue to insist upon it. Next slide, please. When I was Privacy Commissioner of Ontario, Canada, for 3 terms, the first thing I did when I became commissioner was create privacy by design. And the reason for that was, we're talking about 97, 98. When I joined as commissioner, the office was full of brilliant lawyers, who want to apply the law to privacy infractions and data breaches, very important. But you see, my background, I'm not a lawyer. I'm a psychologist. My PhD's in psychology and law. But I wanted a slightly different approach to complement that. I wanted a proactive approach before the fact. I wanted, ideally, to prevent the privacy harms from arising altogether. So this took a little bit of a convincing, if you will, when I got to the office. But then the lawyers understood that I wasn't opposed to privacy laws. I was just hoping that we would have to invoke them less frequently if we could avoid the privacy harms from arising. And literally at my kitchen table over 3 nights, I came out with privacy by design. And it took, the office liked it, and we've been moving on it ever since. In the next slide, please. In, I think it was 2010, in the EU, there are privacy commissioners conferences every year. In 2010, it was in Jerusalem. And at the end of the conference, commissioners are allowed to advance various resolutions to be voted on. And I advanced the resolution that privacy by design should be embedded in new technologies and business practices right from the outset as an essential component of fundamental privacy protection. And I was delighted that it was unanimously passed. I was actually amazed at this because, you see, most commissioners, as I said, they're brilliant lawyers, but they have a very different frame of mind, but they all passed it. So at the end of the conference, I went around thanking all my commissioner lawyers, my colleagues, and asking them that, I was surprised that they all voted in favor of it. And they said, Anne, in this day and age, we need help. We're only reaching the tip of the iceberg. And the next slide, please. If you think of an iceberg, they said most privacy breaches below the tip are remaining unknown, unregulated. We're not getting to them. So they said, we need to challenge this, and regulatory compliance through privacy laws is no longer enough. It is unsustainable as the sole model for ensuring the future of privacy. So I was delighted with this. They understood that it was proactive and legal approaches, both absolutely critical. And the next slide, please. We've had great luck. It's been translated into 40 languages all over the world. And not a week goes by that I don't get a call from some jurisdiction. It's absolutely wonderful. Now, the two essentials to privacy by design, in the next slide, please, are quite simple. Prevent the harms from arising. Be proactive by design up front. And banish zero-sum games. I cannot emphasize that enough. Next slide, please. Zero-sum means win-lose. You can have privacy versus security, or privacy versus data utility. And it's never privacy that wins over the other interests, nor should it be. But I sure as heck wasn't going to let it lose out all the time. That's ridiculous. Get rid of this dated either or win-lose model of zero-sum. Substitute what's called positive sum, privacy and security, privacy and data utility, privacy and marketing. Believe it or not, every year the Canadian Marketing Association invites me to give a keynote at their annual conference. And I go there and I say, I know I'm not the most popular speaker here today at all, the least popular. And fortunately, they laugh. And then they say, well, but we know you have to hear what you have to say. You can do it all. Excuse me. Next slide, please. And this is just a summary of the positive sum model, the power of and. It's getting rid of the zero sum to positive sum, win-win, not either or, win-lose. That one involves unnecessary trade-offs and false dichotomies. I remember my dear colleague Bruce Schneier said, Anne, the zero sum, it's nonsense. It's false dichotomies. Replace versus with and get a much better world. And then the next slide, please. Let me just tell you very quickly, there are 7 foundational principles to privacy by design. I've covered a lot of them. You want to be proactive to prevent the harm from arising. Let me talk about number 2 for a moment. It's very important. Privacy as the default setting. What that means is you don't expect customers or citizens to ask you for privacy and search through all of the terms of service to find the opt-out box or whatever. It says, give me privacy. No. Privacy as the default setting says to people, you don't have to ask for privacy. We give it to you automatically. It's the default setting. We seek your positive consent for the use of your personal information for the primary purpose of the data collection, which we show you. And if you consent to that, great. We use your information for that purpose and that purpose alone. Nothing else. And if another secondary use arises, we have to come back to you and seek additional consent. People love this. And that's why embedding this into the design of your operation so you can't forget about it is wonderful. I've already talked a lot about full functionality, positive sum, win-win, not zero sum. I won't dwell on that. Let me talk about security. End-to-end security is critical. While the term privacy subsumes a much broader set of protections than security alone, in this day and age with daily phishing attacks and all kinds of hackers abounding, if you don't have end-to-end security with full lifecycle protection, you're not going to have any privacy. So please, build in a very strong foundation of security. Visibility and transparency is key. You want to keep it open to data subjects. How are we using your personal information? What are we doing with it? Is it going to any third parties? Visibility is absolutely critical, and you have to be transparent with individuals. And finally, respect for user privacy. If you keep it focused on the user, no problem, because then all of this flows from it. And the user feels like they're in control, and they have great confidence that you're protecting their data. And that, as I've been told by people who've been certified for privacy by design, it builds an enormous competitive advantage over the other guys who don't offer this, because people want privacy these days like never before. Next slide, please. if you feel like taking a look at this, it was published like 10 years ago when I was still privacy commissioner, but these are pieces of work that we did with all kinds of different companies to show that this is doable, just in case you think, well, how are you going to do this? It's too hard to do this. It's not. We've partnered with companies in the private sector and government departments to show that it is eminently doable in terms of mass transit, biometrics, smart meters, home healthcare, big data, data analytics, all kinds of things. You can do this. So if you want to take a look at this, there's the link, and it'll show you all the different ways we've already operationalized it. And the next slide, please. I heard from JPDEC near the end of my third term as privacy commissioner, and it just warmed my heart because privacy by design is not that simple. And here, the Japanese, whose first language is not English, they said privacy by design is considered one of the most important concepts by members of the Japanese Information Processing Development Center. We have heard from Japan's private sector companies that we need to insist on the principle of positive sum, not zero sum, and become enlightened with privacy by design. This just warmed my heart because it showed that people all around the world were grasping this and understanding it. Now, some of you may say, okay, I'm in, but what's it going to cost me? It's going to be really expensive, right? No. Now, of course, there's a cost associated with it. Next slide, please. But the cost associated with doing it proactively by design is a fraction of the cost you will incur when you don't do it and you do breach a privacy law or whatever. There's a data breach. And these days, people are outraged, and they're not just lawsuits that are filed. They're class action lawsuits involving multiple partners will cost you millions of dollars. In fact, at times, the damage to one's brand and reputation and the loss of consumer confidence and trust has been so great, it shuts companies down, just outright. So remember this, spend a little upfront. It'll be a fraction of the cost you will incur if you don't do it. Now, let's turn to the next slide to the GDPR, which you all know, General Data Protection Regulation, was proposed in 2012, was actually enforced in 2018, which is now 5 years ago. It's amazing how quickly this goes. And in the next slide, please, you'll see that I was delighted because they included my privacy by design model and data protection by design, and privacy as the default is in the GDPR. And if you recall, that was the second of the 7 foundational principles of privacy by design. And that's extremely important that they put privacy as the default in to show people that it's like automatic. Your privacy is automatically protected. In the next slide, please. I was amazed when Information Age wrote an article about it, and they said that I had created privacy by design. I've had large influence on security experts, etc. But they refer to the EU and that the fact that privacy by design is heavily referred to in Article 25. And they said it's not too much of a stretch to say that if you implement privacy by design, you've mastered the GDPR. Let me assure you, there's much more to the GDPR than privacy by design. I can assure you of that. But I think the point they're making was that if you follow privacy by design proactively, you'll avoid a lot of the problems that are outlined in the GDPR that people have to be concerned with. So I think that was the point they were making. And to my delight, in the next slide, please, just a few weeks ago, privacy by design has now been recognized as an international standard, an ISO standard, ISO PBD 31700. And this is huge because 31700, sorry. This is huge because ISO is followed all around the world. And I have been getting calls from literally people all around the world. It is so exciting. Japan is interested, Australia, Brazil, I mean, everywhere, Europe, of course. So I am delighted. And in part as a result of this, next slide, please, we've partnered with KPMG, and we've relaunched our Privacy by Design certification program, which means that if you're a company, you think you're doing privacy by design, but you want to be certified so that your customers know you're doing this, well then, all you have to do is come to me, send me an email, whatever, and say you'd like this, and with your consent, I will advise KPMG to contact you and look under the hood, if you will, examine your practices. And then they will report to me. And if they say you're good, you're following privacy by design, I'll issue a certification, which will do wonders for your business in terms of, as I've said, companies have said they've gained a competitive advantage by showing their customers how deeply they value privacy through privacy by design. And in the next slide, please. We also, I teach a course on the global privacy framework of PBD through the Toronto Metropolitan University, which you can find there. Now, let me turn, next slide, just for a moment. This is something negative. Is the tide now turning to surveillance? I mean, I don't want to ignore it. And I'm going back to, next slide, please, 2016 in the UK, where they first passed the Investigatory Powers Bill. And next slide, please. There was immediate reaction to this. Lots of people objected to it. They didn't like it, and they wanted to repeal it. And the next slide, please. And it was just over 100,000 signatures opposing it came through because hackers will abound and everything. I mean, it was very unfortunate, but it remains. And the next slide, please. In the UK, again, mass digital surveillance in 2018 was ruled unlawful. Finally, the Data Retention Investigatory Powers Bill allows data to be harvested for reasons other than fighting serious crime. But this tendency to use surveillance, often by law enforcement agencies, has grown. And in the next slide, please, as Bruce Schneier again says, brilliant cryptographer, is surveillance now becoming the new normal of the internet? In the next slide, he says, and unfortunately, surveillance is now the business model of the internet. Well, we're going to have to change that. Next slide, please. I always talk about the unintended consequences of data because I love this term, data fumes, that data produced as a byproduct of people's use of technological devices and services, which are called data fumes, has enormous implications, both political and practical, for the way that people are treated by the state as well as the private sector. And that's why we have to be so careful with these data fumes, with data brokers abound, third parties who love getting access to this information. Next slide, please. And of course, with the Internet of Things, it's not when there's a breach, it's if. It's when, not if there's a breach. The companies should not be asking whether there will be an attack involving IoT devices and infrastructure, but when, because IoT is like running out the door and acting as if there's no problem. Well, there's a lot of problem. If you run out the door with data, highly sensitive data, you don't take the necessary precautions to protect that data to begin with. Next slide, please. Now, this dates back to 2017. So imagine, I would double this figure that, 1.1 billion identities were stolen in 2016. As I said, I would double that easily. And that's why, in the next slide, please, there's such a vital need for encryption. Encrypting data is absolutely critical. In the next slide, please. I read about this when I was commissioner a long time ago, that encryption is critical to our privacy and our freedom. Encrypting data is absolutely critical so that unauthorized third parties can't just gain access to it without any authorization. It's so important. There's all kinds of encryption. There's end-to-end encryption, very, very strong. There's something called homomorphic encryption that protects the data and enables data analytics and research to take place within the context of encrypted data. There's now synthetic data, which has come out, which is an entirely different look and is completely different from the actual data. Professor Khaled El-Imam has grown this dramatically and is one of the leaders in this field. So just know that we can do this. Despite that, there is so much debate ongoing still. Next slide, please. The debate started years ago where, there were all these terrorist attacks and all over the place. And so government wanted backdoors and keys to encrypted data, because giving the government the keys to encrypted software will make Americans less safe. Excuse me. Next slide, please. I don't agree with that. And then I can't remember, just over a dozen of the world's brilliant cryptographers, absolutely brilliant, wrote a paper in response to this called Keys Under Doormats. And the reason they used that term, they wanted to reach the average person who might leave a key under the doormat, so that their child, if they forget their key, when they come home, they'll be able to gain access to their house, as will unauthorized parties and thieves, of course. So they said, mandating insecurity by requiring government access is just, to all data communications, completely unacceptable. You should take a look at this, because it's written by the brilliant cryptographers all around the world, and they set aside time at MIT and elsewhere to write this paper to reach the public, because that's what they really wanted to do. Next slide, please. And they said, also an article in The Economist, that finding a needle in a haystack, that's what it would argue, that granting intelligence agencies powers to intercept, collect, decrypt, and store personal data only exacerbates the problem of finding the terrorist needle in the public haystack. It's a nightmare. And what actually works, though, in the next slide, please, is what works is a number of various things, encrypting data, what intelligence agencies are working on their wholesale wiretapping of private citizens, does profiling hundreds of millions of good guys help to unmask the few dozen bad guys? No, it doesn't. And that's what we're going to talk about in terms of what you can do. In the next slide, please. You can have targeted surveillance versus indiscriminate surveillance, or phishing expeditions. And in the next slide, please, we talk about a surveillance winter, the chilling effect on freedom, when communications metadata, which at the time was just prized by Michael Hayden, was recently described as having no use in stopping terror attacks. So even if you give all this access to law enforcement, etc., it's going to be of no good in terms of stopping terrorist attacks. In fact, it's a lost cause. Much more effective is targeted surveillance on a distinct group. Next slide, please. We talk about the need for both privacy and security. And Michael Chertoff, who everyone knows, the second Secretary of Homeland Security in the U.S., he said, you can't have privacy without security. To me, the most frustrating thing is when people treat privacy and security as if they were trade-offs. So he objects to zero sum dramatically. He wants positive sum, and I know Michael very well. He's excellent because he really gets it. But it's not just him. Next slide, the NSA chief at the time, Michael Rogers, staked out a very pro-encryption position. Again, in contrast to the FBI. He said encryption is foundational to the future, and arguing about it's a waste of time. While there's been a lot of talk about giving up some privacy for security, both are paramount. You need both, so let's get on with it. In the next slide, please. Once again, tech groups have rejected calls for data encryption backdoors, because what backdoors do is they weaken encryption in the name of national security. This makes no sense whatsoever. They said weakening encryption or creating backdoors for use by the good guys would actually create vulnerabilities to be exploited by the bad guys. Thereby weakening encryption is not a solution. It makes it worse. Please, let's remember this. Now, next slide, please. I did say I would eventually get some positive information. Susan Landau, a dear colleague, amazing. She appeared before the House Judiciary Committee hearing in the U.S. on the encryption tightrope. And she said, rather than providing us with better security, the FBI's efforts to mandate the creation of crypto backdoors will torpedo it. Encryption and other protections secure our systems, should never be undermined. She's brilliant, and we have to listen to what she has to say. In the next slide, please, but also in the EU, government-fueled media hysteria over encryption begins. And Neil Alexander, he said, terrorism will not be defeated by outlawing encryption. That's the message people have to understand. We must not fall into the trap of being distracted. Our right to privacy is crucial, and attempts to erode our right to privacy in the name of national security only serve to harm the innocent, which is the majority of us. Next slide, please. I told you I was going to get to some good news near the end once we get past surveillance. The good news is if you're a business, this is good for you. It's good for business. More and more people value privacy enormously. In the next slide, please. I always said privacy should be viewed as a business issue, not a compliance issue. I even said this when I was privacy commissioner, because it transforms privacy into a competitive business advantage, which is critical. Next slide, please. I love this. This was the end of my third term as commissioner, and I had this letter from JPDEC, which basically said, we've heard from Japan's private sector companies that we need to insist on the principle of positive sum, win-win, not zero sum, and become enlightened with privacy by design. And I always keep saying, if the Japanese get this message and English isn't their first language, surely the rest of us can embrace this. Next slide, please. So how can you do it? How can you embed privacy into your business operations? I'll give you an example. In the next slide, please. There was this company named Bearing Media, and they had developed a cookieless technique to allow ISPs to provision location-based advertising to their customers, but without disclosing their geolocation data. And they used a brilliant double-blind privacy-enabling data architecture, which delivered both privacy and utility. Bearing Media embraced privacy by design right from the start and to form the basis of their platform. And they told their customers they were leading by protecting their data through privacy by design. And privacy by design has been embraced by the public. They're aware of it, and it just attracts customers. And they were very, very successful. They were so successful, this small startup company was acquired by Audience Partners, a much larger, huge company. So win-win. Let's go to the next example. What happens when you don't embed privacy and security? Next slide, please. Lawsuits arise. As I mentioned, they're on the rise. Data breaches all abound. Lawsuits filed against companies that have suffered a data breach are increasingly common, with action being taken for incidents affecting less than 1,000 people, which never used to happen. And so I'd like to remind people of this, that there's enormous risk associated with lawsuits and class action lawsuits if you don't protect privacy. In the next slide, please. The American Bar Association also had a data breach. I mean, really? They suffered a major data breach after hackers entered into their network, and they gained access to older credentials of 1.5 million members. So what I tell people is keeping your data, even data that had been consented to like forever, forget it. You subject yourself to additional risk, which you no longer require because you don't need that data anymore. Delete data which you no longer require. That will make such a difference, and it will really safeguard the remaining data. In the next slide, please. One more example of a data breach, Manulife. Manulife Bank of Canada put thousands of customers at risk due to a lack of strong privacy measures. Too little, too late, thousands of customers. And it always amazes me because this is a fairly large company, and I never understand the lack of focus. And sometimes it takes an incident to transpire, unfortunately, security privacy incident, before people pay attention to it. So let me end, ladies and gentlemen, the next slide, please, with just repeating that both privacy and security risks together are best managed by proactively embedding the principles of privacy by design. You want to prevent the harms from arising, avoid the data breaches, and you can do that by focusing on prevention right up front. It is so much easier, and believe me, far more cost effective to build in privacy and security hand in hand up front rather than after the fact. And it also reflects the most ethical treatment of personal data. And you're going to be hearing a lot more about ethics and AI, Chat GPT, artificial intelligence, all this is growing dramatically. And keep thinking. One of my colleagues said, oh, privacy and security, just think of them, they're holding hands. They're always holding hands. They're walking together, always together. And it's also the most ethical treatment of personal data. I also want you to just throw away zero-sum thinking, either or, privacy versus security. So embrace doubly enabling positive sum systems, privacy and security, privacy and data utility, privacy and marketing. Yes, we can do all of it. And one of my colleagues in Europe, he says, look, if people are smart, they'll lead with privacy by design. Nah, but most of the time, they'll forget about it, and they might get privacy by chance, or worse, they get privacy by disaster, and you get a regulator coming and knocking at your door. This is the last thing you want. So ditch that, focus on privacy and security by design, and make it win for you. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. It's been a pleasure speaking to you today. And if you have any questions or concerns, just email me. I would be delighted to offer any assistance I can. Thank you.